something great about back garden programs, and what are your memories of Raun's from that point of view?
Yeah, I always like the back garden ones. I always thought that some of the best time team ones were the ones where we started with really very little and just in someone's back garden, partly because the people then had such a close connection with the archaeology and were so involved, and Pat certainly in Raun's was, and partly because you kind of built up from nothing, you know, and you learned so much. Whereas if you go to a site where you already know a huge amount, it's difficult to have that same sort of impact in just 3 days.
And did it begin for you with, on that first day, seeing the skull? At what point did you feel that you kind of understood the strategy? I got very scared when I saw a picture of Helen or somebody, or maybe it was you, showed me a picture of an Anglo-Saxon graveyard and saying, of course, there's one here and there's one here, but if we dig in between them, we won't find anything. Was there a slight sort of sense of panic, or how did you feel about it?
I think my main sensation was a slight frustration because I was quite pregnant at the time and wasn't allowed in the trenches. Remember, for the insurance, I wasn't allowed in the trenches. And if you watch the programme, you can A, see I'm pregnant, and B, see that I'm never in the trenches. And, you know, my main area of specialism is the medieval period. So it was quite frustrating not being able to get sort of as close as I'd really have liked to excavating that. And Raun's, of all medieval sites, is absolutely iconic because, as they say in the programme, there's been sort of 10 years of work done. It's one of the great medieval sites. There's sort of late medieval settlement, there's a manorial site, there's a lost church. So it would have been an amazing site to dig on. But yes, I mean, that's always the problem with a back garden dig, isn't it? Someone uses the example of battleships, and it's just so you are just sort of stabbing in the dark, really. And Anglo-Saxon cemeteries aren't laid out in a regular way. You just hit pot luck.
What was the first time you saw something coming out of a trench and thought, oh, we might actually do this? Did they call you over and you looked in the trench at the first burial we found? How did you arrive at realising we actually had some burials, apart from the skull, of course?
I think the first point at which I realised we were actually going to find some burials was, I think I heard it over comms, which was always the way, of course, when you were filming. As I said, I wasn't really allowed too near the trenches, but you know, graves are so recognisable, and even standing on the edge and just looking at it, and you know, the subsoil was distinctly lighter than the grave fill, so it was very easy to see. It was a magical moment.
And what was extraordinary was I'm sort of going to the end of the programme in a way, but I've got such a memory of Victor's picture and seeing those objects around the woman that was buried there. And what did you identify with any of those objects in particular? Did you find them interesting? Which objects do you remember that sort of were collected round her in that strange way, round her head and down?
Yeah, I remember really being really interested in that, actually, but because she was in her early 20s, and she wasn't that much younger than I was then. And she had the beautiful jewellery with the bead. I thought was particularly nice. I like that colour blue, and it's a very recognisable object. And then it was the fact that she had that little dog sort of curled up at her feet, and we thought those bones at first were going to be a child because they were small. But actually they turned out to be an animal, and then turned out to be a dog. It wasn't sort of food remains. So she'd got such a household with her. She'd got her dog, she'd got a pot that might have been food, or might have just symbolised her as being a sort of someone in charge of a household. She'd got beautiful jewellery. And so often with pagan Anglo-Saxon graves, you might get a knife, or many of them don't have anything with them at all. So it was incredibly lucky. But also it was just very poignant sort of household, and you wonder, did the dog die at the same time? Was it her favourite pet? I would really like to know more about the dog, actually. Presumably they didn't kill it to go in the grave with her, but why were they buried at the same time? I think there's a shaggy dog story in there somewhere.
And at that moment, when the pot was discovered by a head, and is that kind of pot with those kind of ridges on it, is that a relatively common object? And why does it is there any idea why it gets put at the head end? And what does it normally have in it? Do you know a little bit more about that kind of Anglo-Saxon pottery?
Well, it's interesting because the pot that came up with Henry was a different sort of pot, and that's much more similar to the pot you get in cremation cemeteries, which actually have cremated bone in them. Now, that's obviously not what we've got at this cemetery. It's an inhumation cemetery where people are just put into the grave entire. You've got the whole body going in. And that pot that the woman that we excavated was buried with is just a domestic pot. It's got the soot from being cooked on an open fire on it. So it's not being used specifically for cremation. I mean, some of the cremation pots were used for cooking before, but this one with the woman we dug, clearly she got that pot with her that had been cooked recently enough to have that soot still on the pot when it went in the grave. I'd love to have done some residue analysis on it and seen what might have been in it.
It's almost the equivalent nowadays of a modern person being buried with a I don't know, a pan or some sort of nice something from the kitchen. And it probably reflects in a way that pottery for them was a much rarer object than it is for us, obviously.
Well, it makes you wonder as well as to whether we found that pot, but she may well have had sort of wooden vessels or leather vessels with her as well. Other sort of cooking, utensils or kitchen utensils or cooking pots, household items. We recover so little of what might have been in there in the first place. We don't know if it's there because it had her favourite meal in it, or it's because it was her favourite pot she always cooked with, or whether because it was just, a pot they happened to have.
And when we start talking about objects from Anglo-Saxon graves, I always remember that extraordinary site at Bremer that you were involved in, and where I think on that particular occasion, technically, one of the cameramen had suggested that we use what's sometimes called a lipstick camera, a small camera, and you were excavating those multiply stacked buckets.
Buckets, yes.
Anglo-Saxon buckets. I mean, Anglo-Saxon graves are extraordinary things. Is it sort of one of the things you remember from Time Team, the Anglo-Saxon graves?
I think that Time Team, everyone was special and different. Actually, and it sounds unlikely to say that, but I can't remember any that one thought, "Oh, well, that was a bit of a dud." And I think that's a testament to the research that went into it, the resources that could be thrown at it, and the commitment that everyone put into getting a lot done. As I say, the main period I research in is Anglo-Saxon and medieval, that whole sort of between about 500 and 1500 AD. So, those cemeteries are amazing. And, as soon as you get after about 850, 900, 950 AD, you don't get stuff in graves, or very rarely from then on. So the Anglo-Saxon period is a bit of the pagan period is a bit of a treat when you are getting stuff, and it just makes you wonder what their houses look like.
And this makes me think a little bit about, we've asked, one or two people have asked us a little bit more of the context of Raunds. This is about 450, 500, do you think?
I think the burial was about 7th century, wasn't it? 6th, 7th century.
Okay. And what was this? These are Anglo-Saxons. Do you know by any chance? Stuart and I were trying to work out who the king was at that time, if it was Athelstan or quite who it was. Um, but you know, in a sense, Raunds is quite a busy place, isn't it? There's quite a lot's been done on it, and you wonder what the bigger were these the sons and daughters of immigrants, or were they, do people do genetic studies which can tell us whether these are effectively Scandinavians, a lot of blonde haired people like you possibly?
Well, a certain amount of work has been done on the ancient DNA, trying to sort of work out the genetic lineages. It's there's a lot of debate about quite how reliable that is and how that works, and often they're just tracing the male line lineage or the female line lineage because they just look at the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA. It's getting better, but of course the problem is, you know, you have quite a lot of ancestors when you get back even just 3 or 4 generations. So most people in that part of England, or what, you know, the area that was England, became England, you know, Northamptonshire, they probably have very mixed heritage. What's really interesting though is if that burial was 7th century, which the finds seem to suggest it was from what Helen was saying, then that's only really just after the conversion to Christianity. So that's happening in the English kingdoms at the, you know, end of the 6th century. So these are people that perhaps would remembered, you know, even 50 years ago. So Henry, as he was rather inappropriately called, Henry is not an Anglo-Saxon name. I was thinking about, we had a conversation about that, was cut out of the film. But anyhow, the original male burial, you know, that was aged to be around about pushing 60 at death.
Yeah,
They would have lived through, yes, but they would have lived through the period when Christianity became more widespread from that initial conversion in the 590s. You know, gradually that new religion would have become established, and that those burials are buried in Christian style, east-west orientated, but with artifacts, which is not really a Christian practice, but they didn't forbid it at all. It clearly carries on as a sort of fusion religion. And we remember how the Romans used to do the sort of thing of saying, oh, your God, you know, here's your God Sulis, here's our God Minerva. They're both the same sort of God. Let's have a great fine female God and call her Sulis Minerva. And it seems to be that the Anglo-Saxon period of conversion was rather similar. They just let people get on with doing what they wanted. But it's interesting to think that particularly that male burial would have lived through that period, and seen that change coming in when everyone's beliefs were very fluid. So I think that's more interesting in terms of their kind of identity in many ways than whether their great-great-grandfather was British or came from the continent.
And it's interesting, we've mentioned a couple of things. We often think, oh, if only we'd have had the technology we have now, or we had lots more time. And if you were going back, more money. Yeah. Well, anyway, when you think of Raunds, you've mentioned the pot, and I don't think we did. I don't think it was subsequently looked at, the interior of that pot. I don't know. We're trying to sort of track back what happened to it. But residues might have been interesting. Was it, you know, a last meal, or was it mead or something? If we were able to go back to the bones, which I presume are in the museum, could we actually still do a DNA analysis of that material from the bones?
You could give it a go. I mean, the best place, I mean, your problem with DNA analysis is always contamination. Yeah. So ideally, you really want to kind of take a sample at the time and keep it, make sure it doesn't get contaminated. Normally, the best place to get any sort of information like that is from within the teeth, because they provide a little sort of capsule cavity that's kind of effectively sealed up in the middle of the teeth. So depending what sort of conditions it's been in, it would be worth a try. And of course, you could do we could do work on isotopes, for example, and compare isotopes to tell you if the place you were buried in is the same as the place you were born in. They can actually say something about your diet. So that, that would be interesting. It might to compare the man and the woman would be interesting. They're a different age.
And they had good teeth too, because I
Oh, you
remember
might be all right then. Yeah.
somebody commenting on how good the teeth were. Did
Yeah.
you ever?
The other thing is whether there's any relationship between the burials. So we got 3 burials: a man, a woman, and a child. And okay, the man's a lot older than the man's about 40 years older than the woman at death. And we don't know if they were buried at the same time, of course. And again, the child is 8 years old, and we don't know if they were buried at the same time. They could have been, the 3 burials could have spanned 100 years, but it's unlikely because they are quite close together and there doesn't seem to be any in between. So it's an interesting question as to whether they're a family group, a father and a daughter and a grandchild or something even perhaps. That would be something we could look at from DNA as well, if we could get a good reconstruction on it. It's always a bit of a long shot, but it would be interesting to have a look.
And just out of interest, do you know, is Raunds the original name of the medieval settlement there, or was there a previous? I can't remember whether we looked into this at all, but
I think it's the earliest known name. I mean, I think it's Raunds in Domesday Book, and I think I'm pretty sure there are Anglo-Saxon Charter references to it. I can't remember what its meaning is offhand, but I don't think it's a name that jars as an Anglo-Saxon name or an Old English name, more accurately. It doesn't sound terribly Scandinavian. It doesn't sound particularly.
Not got BY at the end or anything like that.
No. You give me 5 minutes, I can look it up. My books are all in the university, and I can't get at them at the moment.
Have you, in the course of other work you've done, have you been involved with that sort of closer to the excavation? Because obviously you weren't in the trenches there. But was that something that, because excavating a skeleton is quite something, isn't it, one way or another?
It's a very personal thing. I mean, you're very, very close to someone's body. Not many people's bodies you get that close to you in your life anyhow, especially not at the moment with social distancing. But it is very close. It's very intimate. Generally, you only normally have one person on a skeleton at a time, because there's not enough space. Sometimes you're in a grave that's cramped anyway. So it's actually a very closed-in space as well. So it is very intimate, and there's that strange thing that you are closer to their body really than they were, almost, because you're seeing their bones and they would never have seen that. And you're finding out things about them, particularly if you're looking at sort of parentage or diseases or diet, and maybe things about the age at which they were breastfed till, or whether they suffered from osteoporosis, or that sort of thing. You've got that information that actually they wouldn't have known about themselves, and yet, they're a human being. You're a human being. You're within inches, really, of them. It is a very intimate experience.
And given your interest in this area, are there some places that you still think, if you were given a choice to take Team off and do the site you wanted to do, like Mick was always taking us to early religious sites, and Phil was always desperate to avoid the Romans for some prejudicial reason I never understood. Are there some sort of, if you had the team all together again, and where would you like to take them?
There's a really interesting category of sites that I've excavated small areas on several of over the last 5 or 10 years, and that is Norman period castles or enclosed sites, enclosures, which are starting to turn up really quite frequently, human remains in them. So there's some excavations going on at Clare Castle in Suffolk at the moment, currently, and there's a cemetery in the Bailey there. And then at Nayland, not very far away, there's a medieval enclosure on the edge of the village with a medieval manorial site in it, and they turned up human remains in that as well. At Saffron Walden, there's a castle with a marketplace, and the church is in the Bailey. And so I think there's some really interesting work to be done looking at some more of these castle sites or these enclosures, these kind of lordly sites, and actually seeing how many of them have cemeteries within them, because it's a really interesting question of what happens at the Norman conquest. Do the Normans build their castles on sites that the Anglo-Saxons are already using, either as, lordly sites, and how does that affect the people who are being buried there? If there's an existing churchyard, are the Normans taking that over? Or do they create a church and then people are being buried in that afterwards? And often these churchyards just get, these graveyards just get completely forgotten about within 150 years of the Norman conquest. They've been flattened over and someone's built a manor house on top of them, or a bit more of a castle. So I think that's a really interesting question. And it says something about the impact of the Norman conquest. What difference did it make?
And is it the implication of what you're saying that it's highly likely that in some of these places, those are going to be Saxon cemeteries that the Normans have taken over to an extent?
That's the interesting question. So that's why it'd be interesting to dig them, because if we could get some more information, and a combination of obviously archaeological research and documentary research, but if we could get a clearer idea of whether these cemeteries predate the conquest, and then whether the building of the castle kind of respects them, or does it just cut across them? So in most of these sites I've worked on, it's only been a relatively small area of excavations being done as a community dig or something. And we don't know the limits of the cemetery. So we don't know if there's a much bigger cemetery that the castle's then plonked on, disrespecting it, as it were, or whether actually this cemetery is already there, the enclosure of the cemetery is mimicked in the enclosure of the castle, and the castle is respecting it. That's why it'd be interesting to do some more research. And of course, we could then look at the isotopes to see if the people buried in these cemeteries, have they come from, are they local? Were they born and bred locally, or have they come in from somewhere else, like Normandy, for example? We wouldn't expect much of that, because we don't think many people actually came over at the conquest. But it would be interesting to see change of diet. Is there a change of diet at all in these populations? But I think really it's yes, if the question is, what date were they? And we need quite a lot of radiocarbon dates that you can start to do some Bayesian analysis on, statistical analysis, to really work out, radiocarbon dates are never precise to the year. Ideally, we want a load of people with timber coffins we could get a dendro date on, but they don't survive.